chime tells us that it is 9 o'clock, and we'd call this meeting to order this morning of the DDA. We'd like to stand, and we'll do the invocation and then the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Father God, thank you for each one here, for their talents, abilities, and their unique strengths. I ask today that as we meet today, you would guide each of us and bring about creativity, fresh vision, and unity. Positively impact the town of Tyrone through all of us, and positively impact each individual and family.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, this is our first of two public comment periods. Anybody wishing to say something that is not on the agenda today is welcome to come up and speak. Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
I make a motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Do we make a motion for the approval of the minutes for June 13th of 2022?
A motion.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. This morning we have the pleasure of having Mr. Tom Owens to give us a little information on some financial tools for our organization here.
All right.
Tom, thank you.
Yes,
for
sir.
being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Chairman said, I'm Tom Owens. I'm with Raymond James and Associates. You probably know our firm as a full-service brokerage firm. I work in the public finance department, which means we assist cities, counties, school districts, and authorities with the issuance of bonds. We do bond underwriting, placement agent services, and financial advisory services, which those roles have slightly nuanced, different meanings. But we do that mainly for governmental and not-for-profit issuers. My focus is exclusively in the state of Georgia. I'm going to talk to you this morning just a little bit about, what can we do as a downtown development authority, and really with a focus on financing and bonds. How are those tools that the DDA uses to further its purposes? And then it's really, you guys ask questions, we'll do our best to respond to those. Just by way of background, we work for a lot of, we really look at a city and its authorities as one unit, right? I mean, you're not in an adverse position to your city government. And so when I say we work for these cities, we generally work for those cities and all their authorities. But my colleague Todd Barnes has represented Peachtree City for over 30 years as their advisor. We work for Fayette County School District, all your cities in Cobb County, Smyrna, Ackworth, Powder Springs, Austell, Kennesaw. But a lot of their efforts have been similar to what you're doing here. Some of those cities did not have, Kennesaw comes to mind in particular, what you would think of as a traditional, downtown or a town center. It's just sort of over time. This is an area where people sort of congregated, but it didn't have a downtown feel. And that's certainly become something over the past, 20 to 25 years that cities are focusing on developing a town center and, a real center of their community with public amenities, but also private amenities that sort of develop around those public, the weight of those public amenities. So I've got to put a presentation in front of each of you. I do not intend to go through this entire presentation. A lot of this is reference material, and if you ask a question, we may reference back to some particular slides. But one of the things we generally like to start off with is just interest rates in general. Right? Where are things? What's our cost of borrowing look like? This chart, which is page 2 of our presentation, is a historical look. There's been an index kept since 1993, so almost a 30-year history of tax-exempt interest rates. These are AAA interest rates. Most of your governmental borrowing happens between 1 and 30 years, and so on the far left here, you see a 1-year rate, the far right's 30 years, and those light blue bars are the range. That's the high and low of where tax-exempt rates have been. There's a navy blue bar right through the middle, which is the historical average of tax-exempt rates, and that red line's just where we are today. So just big picture, we are certainly off the lows that we saw sort of last fall, earlier this spring, but historically speaking, we're still in a very positive interest rate environment for borrowers. Some of the borrowing you may do could be on a taxable basis, which is a little different than the tax-exempt rates, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. I'm going to, well, let's stop right here for 1 second. If you look at the Georgia statute, the legislative purpose of a downtown development authority, and this is, I'm sure, remedial for you all, particularly seasoned members of your authority, but your purpose is the revitalization and redevelopment of the central business district of your city or town. And you do that with the purpose not only to, why do we redevelop it? There's a phrase that's very important in Georgia law, which is to spur trade, industry, commerce, and employment opportunities. All right, so everything we need to do is not just, well, we want to make that downtown or the town center nice. We want to do it so that we have economic activity. Right, that's really the goal in terms of legislative purpose, and that has effects down the road in the types of projects that you can actually finance as a DDA. You need to have a goal on, or the things we're doing, promoting trade, commerce, industry, and employment opportunities. That's particularly from a financing perspective. I'm going to skip ahead here. But I'll say one more thing. You have some other tools, the city has some other tools to do what are purely public purpose projects. That's not really the DDA's focus. Yours is more spurring private or the redevelopment, revitalization of a commercial district. Where you have public purpose projects, the city really probably has some better tools than the DDA. For instance, this town, the town hall that we're in now, I believe was financed through a public facilities authority, which just is a little closer to true public purposes. But if we look at page 8, what are the things that a downtown development authority can do? And you guys are doing some of these things already. But you develop and promote your downtown area, make long-range plans. I've looked through and read your town center plan, and it's fantastic. I think it gives you some great direction. But then how do you implement those things, right? And the DDA can purchase property, you can lease property, you can rent your property out to other people, and you can also finance projects that you think are furthering those trade, industry, commerce, and employment opportunity goals. And so I just want to talk about really the 3 ways that bonds are used to do those things. The first one is that there are occasionally projects that want to use your authority as what we would call a conduit issuer. That means that the authority has no monetary exposure to the project whatsoever, but and I'm going to talk more about each of these, so I'll give you some examples. But there are times when a governmental issuer is necessary for what is an otherwise private party to take on some type of a project. And that's generally because they can access tax-exempt financing if they use a governmental bond issuer. And so they may come to you as an authority and say, we'd like you to issue bonds. You have no payment obligation whatsoever under those bonds, but we need a governmental conduit just to pass our bonds through. And I'll show you some examples of that in just a moment. The second one, which may be a little more relevant to you, is the DDA and the city can get together. The city or town has the legal ability to levy up to 3 mills of property tax, or rather to pledge its support of up to 3 mills of property tax to a bond. And so you may have a economic development type prospect that you feel strongly about, and they come and they say, we would really like, we need to finance a project here in the city. It'd be very helpful to us to get financing if the bank could look to the town, and the town has sort of stamped it and said, either we're willing to outright make the payments on this debt, or we'll backstop that debt. If for some reason that industry doesn't pan out as planned, there's a city backstop behind it, and they have entered into a contract with the authority to provide support in the form of tax millage to that project. And I'll give some more examples of those in just a moment. And then the third, and this may be more relevant to the development authority, but DDAs have similar powers, is that occasionally you will get a industry that wants a tax abatement. And so there's a process by which they can title property in your name. There's a bonding arrangement that comes behind that. But by going through that process, you can abate taxes for a particular business or industry. You know, it may be so important. The example I've got in here is Facebook putting server farms out in Newton County. Newton County was happy to have those located there. In exchange, they've offered a tax abatement through a joint development authority. So it's or the Rivian plant, which is going out that way right now. And you may have read that abatement is actually tied up in the court right now. But they're saying a large manufacturer is so important to the area, we're willing to abate taxes. And then on the back end of that industry is actually making a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes back to the sponsoring government. But it's not in the amount that they would be charged if they were just a regular taxpayer. But bonds are the way that you facilitate those agreements as well. But when we look at the first category of those, the first is what I call a conduit bond. A lot of times you have a not-for-profit, a 501c3 corporation who is eligible to borrow tax exempt. This could be somebody like someone as small, but in terms of a single unit, a Goodwill, for instance. Those folks are eligible to borrow on a tax exempt basis, but they need a governmental sponsor to do so. So if they wanted to put a facility here somewhere, they may come to you and say, would you issue bonds on our behalf? We can get our own financing. We'll put up all the money for the payments, but our bonds are tax exempt if we pass them through a governmental bond issuer. And so they may come and ask you to do that. You'll have agreements in place that put you under no financial obligation whatsoever, but they've issued bonds in your name, and it'll say for the Goodwill Project. University student housing is done this way. A lot of times, and I think that maybe one of the examples here I have in Bibb County. Middle Georgia College has a campus there. They issue student housing bonds, which is a governmental tax exempt purpose. They have a foundation that technically owns that dorm, but they do so underneath a local development authority. They're purely an issuer for those bonds. They don't do anything else. But they allow that industry, they are helping an industry locally to access tax exempt financing, or a business locally, or a not-for-profit locally. You will occasionally have a taxable purpose come to you and ask you to issue bonds. That's few and far between. But the other thing you may occasionally have someone ask for is an industrial development bond, an IDB, which says certain types of manufacturing, small manufacturing, is eligible for tax-exempt financing if they meet certain criteria. And they also need a governmental sponsor. So they may come and say, again, we're not asking anything from you financially, but we would like you to act just as a conduit to issue our bonds so that we can access that tax-exempt financing. A second category, and this is probably mostly what we're thinking of when we think of how can the DDA do things in terms of bonding, and I mentioned it briefly before. Cities and towns can levy up to 3 mills of tax for economic development purposes. Oftentimes, they will contract with they'll enter into intergovernmental contract with their downtown development authority and say, we want you to actually carry those things out. We're willing to pledge up to 3 mills to do so. A good example of this is in Kennesaw recently. They had an extended stay motel that was on 41, right on the edge of downtown. It caught on fire. It was really in a state of disrepair, and the city said, we'd really like to get that piece of property because, one, we're getting rid of an extended stay motel on one of the gateways to our downtown, but we'd like to see something else go there. It is difficult, if not impossible now, for a city government to just condemn a piece of private property and give it to somebody else for development. So occasionally, if a sort of key parcel of land comes available, town, along with the authority, may say, we really, that is an important piece of land for what we're trying to do. It may make sense for us to just acquire that. And over time, we'll either, and so you can issue into a bond, let me step back, you can issue a bond to pay for the acquisition of that property, and then going forward, you could rent that property, you could sell that property to a new prospect, or if that prospect was so important to you, you could even give that property away. But that's one of the things you do is you issue bonds, but you have to have a financial backing in order to do that. The DDA in and of itself doesn't have the ability to raise funds in terms of taxes. And so you would work along with your city and say, here's what we'd like to do. We think this is important for our overall redevelopment purpose. If you agree, we'd like to issue these bonds and have you sort of sponsor us to do so. You can also do that just to benefit an industry, right? Somebody may say, hey, I can get financing on my own, but it's going to cost me 8%. If I had the city backstop, that is 2.5 or 3%. All right, so it would just be advantageous for us not to, and they can still make the payments, but you've just cut their interest rate dramatically because you have a body with taxing power behind it, and you'd have agreements in place. Well, what happens if the company goes out of business? What do you have in terms of security? Those are the details you get into. But occasionally you may say, we'd really like to help this particular business or whatever it may be out, and so we'll offer our backing. We have no intention of actually making those payments. That would be sort of a everything's gone wrong type scenario, but we think it's got a substantial benefit for them to lower their interest rate, make their cost of debt lower, therefore maybe they're more successful. Another way, and it may be applicable here, you might offer an inducement like that. For instance, if you have the fire station, you want it to turn into something different, you may have somebody who says, here's what I would do in this building, what I propose to do. And you look at it and you say, I like that. I'd really like it if architecturally it was consistent with Town Hall across the street, right? And so we would be willing to assist you to take your project from here to something that we'd rather have, aesthetically, as opposed to what you're doing, what you had initially planned to do. What if we, use some of these mechanisms and that allowed you to, hadn't changed the economics of what you're doing, but we are asking you to do something that would be more expensive than what you initially planned, but we're willing to use one of these tools to get that project to a different level. I think that's something that you see quite frequently, but again, it really, some of this is facts and circumstances. What projects are you looking at? What kind of prospects do you have that are proposing to do things on these sites? And it's, this is where you get into something that really needs to kind of be collaborative and specific conversation. But those are the two things I think you primarily would be asked to do from a bonding perspective. Either act as a conduit for someone or be more directly involved in order to either spur development that's not happening or to get it to a level beyond what's initially proposed, just by improving the economic incentive for someone. And that's probably, there's a lot of other reference type material in here that, if you have questions, we may refer back to. But I think those two big things from a bonding perspective are where I would focus my time if I was a downtown development authority. But does that bring up questions? Are there things, I'm sure you've got a lot of ideas, but are there things directly you'd like for me to address, or ideas, or anything you want me to go over?
Don't have anything.
And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is all new to most of us
yes, sir.
anyway. Brandon and Philip have had probably a little more experience in that than us, but where does the initial money come from to start all that? You're putting a bond out there, okay?
Sure.
What does that actually mean? Does that mean that you're looking for people to bring, to invest in this?
So there are a number of different ways. More often than not, your active involvement in a project is going to require the town to assist you with that. I mean, just because nobody really lends on a totally unsecured basis with no, you know, how am I going to get paid back, right? So the majority of what we see are projects done by a DDA in conjunction with their sponsoring government who says, we agree that that's something that would be good, and what level of involvement, you know, what level of pledge do you get from the sponsoring government just depends on what it is. And it's all over the board. But the majority of time, I mean, it just, like you said, where do you start? You know, something's got to get that ball rolling. Now, there have been times where, for instance, back to that Kennesaw example, right? They bought a piece of property, it was important enough, and they had a really short window, right? So we did a 20-year financing because that made the payment, say that nothing happened with that property, right? The economy turns down and now we own this piece of property. We really want a manageable payment going forward. But at that point, you also have options. And again, it's collaborative between the authority and the city. But at that point, they say, okay, now we have somebody who wants that property. And they actually bought it and leveled the hotel, right? They improved the property to make it more marketable. But at that point, you say, is this site attractive to someone? Yes, okay. Well, if it is, what price do they want to pay? And do we need to get our full investment back out of it? Or is it worth it to take, you know, a small loss on that property? Is it worth it to give that property away altogether? And that really depends on, you know, what's the proposal? Who's coming there, right? I mean, is it something you want badly enough to say, hey, if they'll come, we're willing to just give them the property outright? But it may be something that you say, yeah, that's great. What do you need to pay for it? Or you also have the ability to say, we'd sell it to you at one price if this is the outcome. If you do something and you make it, you know, architecturally similar to our other buildings, we'll sell it to you for a lower price, right? There's all kinds of flexibility that you have in that. But it's really just, you know, what do you want? You know, one of the things we talk about all the time is, you know, come up with the plan, which you've done. But when you have a prospect, you know, figure out what's ideal, and let's back up from there to see what does it take to get us there? You know, is that a price that's too steep or not? But everything's different. You know, I mean, everything's different down to the specific parcel that you're talking about. You could have a parcel that's just so important that people are just fighting over it, right? There's no need to provide any incentive. In downtown Smyrna, they had some apartment complexes that had old HUD financing on them, and they became, as Smyrna grew and grew and they redeveloped downtown, they became extremely valuable pieces of property. But there was a deal on the back end with HUD that said, you know, they went into foreclosure. The city wanted to buy them from HUD. HUD said that's fine, so we did a little financing to purchase those properties outright. But we had an agreement with HUD that we could not sell them for more than we paid for them. Well, they were worth more than that, so we sold them for that same price, but we also had an agreement amongst developers. We had a bid off who would make the largest contribution to other city facilities, right? City of Smyrna got a library out of that. It was, you know, because, you know, that's just the kind of creativity, but you have to think it really is what's the project and, you know, who wants it and what incentive do we need to provide. So really just comes down to what you're actually looking at any given time.
Very good. Does anybody else have any thoughts? Brandon?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I remember when we were going through the finance process and the bond process for this building, and there was terminology, and this has been several years ago, and I don't remember the exact terminology, but basically there is a limitation on how much debt a city can carry or an entity can carry, and I think there was a formula and it included somewhere around 7% of revenues, something along those lines. Does that apply to the types of bonds that you're discussing?
Here, you generally have a 3 mil limitation in terms of how much annual payment the city can backstop.
As long as the city can back whatever 3 mills.
That's right. If it produced $0, could the city levy 3 mills and make the whole payment? And that takes into account anything else. You know, you may have multiple projects that you've pledged that economic development millage to. So you have to take into account all of them, you know, what capacity is left. There are some, the city has some specific, well, I believe you have a 15 mil charter cap on your overall M&O millage. And so everything generally has to fit within that 15 mils, and I would guess you're not, you're not up against 15 mils.
Nowhere close.
There are some limitations for leases. The payments on leases can only be 7.5% of your local tax revenue.
That's what.
So if it's but that applies to copy machines and police cars and everything else that you might lease. But the total of your leases is 7.5%. And then there's a limitation for general obligation debt of the city, which is 10% of your tax digest. But a general obligation bond is different than what the DDA may issue.
So conduit bonds would not have any sort of limitations since it's,
That's correct. There are a few development authorities in the state that have a cap on how much they can do, but you're a statutory downtown development authority, so you don't have to worry about that. I think like the DeKalb Development Authority has maybe a $40 million limit, but that's a specific legislative act, and you don't have that to worry about here.
Philip, any thoughts?
You said that, you know, I imagine that most revenue bonds are based on the basis of tax to be able to cover that.
Correct.
Are there any revenue bonds that are issued on the basis of leasing? Perhaps even,
They can be. The trouble is you get into a situation with a bank where they're really just making a commercial loan at that point, right? And there may be reasons for them to run their commercial loan through the authority, but most of the time, in terms of interest rate, what you see is a town or city backstop that bond, and then the city may have that agreement, right? It's far easier for the city to understand the business deal they have with some entity, and then just wrap it and get, you know, from a financing perspective, right? Every bank can look at the town of Tyrone and say, we know what we've got. You can have 20 banks that may want to make that loan, as opposed to you know, you may have somebody with a banking relationship is the alternative. I mean, so the question is really, what do they get from using the authority as opposed to just going straight to their bank, right? And there's not a lot of reason for them to run their loan through the authority if it's just going to be, you know, the strength of their own, you know, their own pledge, right? Now the authority and city can say, you know, we're going to back it, but we want a security interest in your property, and these are the payments you're going to make to us each year, and all those type of things.
unless it's a very mature development
That's
authority
right.
that
I mean,
has
if it's,
a history with a
you
lot of
know,
revenue.
if it's
tied to it.
Walmart, you know, whatever it may be, they can get financing, but they also aren't going to come to the authority and say, we need you to help us out, right? So,
And if it's a revenue bond that's based on, you know, tax or millage, that require the town to actually make that millage increase, or is it based on the potential to enact
That's
the
right.
millage
So
increase?
generally, the way that works, it just depends on what the plan is, right? If you're buying property and giving it away, the city's going to need to budget to make that payment, right? You purchased a piece of property outright. Generally, the way we would look at it is the city needs to have available fund balance to make 1 year's worth of that payment, right? To give us time, if something went wrong, to levy taxes the following year.
Takes time, yeah.
Right, but I wouldn't, you know, if it's just sort of what we call a kind of a standby arrangement where you're just backstopping it, you don't, I mean, the expectation is that you're not levying that 3 mils, but you need the ability to, and you need the ability to get to that next tax cycle where we might have to levy that millage.
You just take a look at basically the tax digest within the boundary.
That's correct.
That's your lending.
That's
basis.
right. That your annual payment needs to be underneath that with a little bit of margin, right? I mean, you're not right up against it. You won't, tax digest goes down. And frankly, you generally you want to reserve some of that 3 mils in case something else comes along, right? we rarely get right up against the.
Ellie, you had any thoughts or questions?
I got one just
Yes,
real
sir.
quick. So, just so I'm clear, where does Raymond James come in with all this? Are you the one that issues the bonds?
So we would generally act as your underwriter or your placement agent, meaning if it's a public sale, we go out and find investors in amounts as small as $5,000 up to whatever the amount, somebody may buy $1 million worth of your bonds. But we go find the individual investors in what we call a public sale scenario, where there's a prospectus and a bond rating and the bonds are offered to the public. Or we could act as a placement agent, which is, we take that bond and we offer it to generally institutions, banks, who would say, we'll purchase the entire bond, or two banks that will purchase the bond directly. And so that would be more of a placement agent role. They're functionally the same thing. What we normally do is we just go out and we say, what's the public market rate look like today? Are banks willing to lend at that same rate or lower? And if not, we go public markets. If banks are giving you deals that are just as good, you would do it directly with the bank. But we typically are assisting you with finding those investors who would purchase the bonds, is our role.
There's some examples of entities that are issuing, I know for the town, for this building, the Georgia Municipal Association was offering a
Right.
bond. That's probably unique.
Yeah,
but-
so that's through a lease. That's a lease project that the Georgia Municipal Association Bricks and Mortar program. And so that is a lease, so it is subject to that $7.5 million limitation. And they have a few lenders that lend, you probably have, I would guess it's truest, it was BB&T that made virtually all of the GMA loans at one point. So I would guess that's probably who did that financing, but I'm not certain on that. But it's similar to that. That's similar to a placement agent type role. They limited that distribution just to banks. You could do it, and some of that, at some point, if it's $1 million borrowing, that's probably not worth the effort to get a rating and, put together a prospectus and go through the costs that are necessary to get a bond out in the public markets. If it's a $10 million bond, those costs, spread across a bigger number. If you get a better rate, that's obviously worth that effort to go through. So it just depends on how much you're borrowing, which route you go.
But in terms of revenue bonds, are tax allocation districts involved in that at any level, or is that?
So a tax allocation district is a little bit different. The best way I can describe a tax allocation district is it's sort of like a general obligation of a smaller area. And it's also only the incremental taxes produced off, you freeze taxes to the extent it grows. There's some other ways to do those that maybe, if you go down that road, it's difficult to do those initially with no history because there's no growth there yet. There's some other ways we can, if you have interest, we can talk about that may be a little easier to get those done, but.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely.
Tom, thank you so very much for your time and the information. It's a lot for us to digest.
That's okay.
But it does give us a lot of food for thought, and it'll certainly spur other questions that, our group here can go
Great.
over.
Well,
But
my
thank you.
information's on the front of this, and I'm happy to come back and talk to you guys as often as needed. And, in meeting, out of meeting, whatever you need, just please let me know.
Very good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Now we go to new business, consideration to approve the purchase of a custom branded event tent from Easy Up. Philip?
Okay, so we, kind of on the vein of branding and just kind of where we picked up from our last meeting, we, we put together some quotes and some different presentations here for a tent for events. I know we're coming up on our last event here, but, this will be utilized for next year anytime the DDA wants to be present at any other town event like Founder's Day or anything like that. So we put together these two different options. There's a 10 by 10 tent and a 10 by 15. The 10 by 10 tent is approximately $613. The 10 by 15 tent is approximately $1,200. Both tents have a customization option of a main image on one peak and lettering on the front valance. Easy Up allows for multiple peaks and valances to be customized for added cost. If you wanted to do 2 peaks and do valances front and back, it would be approximately $250 more per tent. It seems like it's about the same, whether it's a 10 by 10 or a 10 by 15. I did a little fiscal comparison just because I know we use tents. Right now, we rent them. The DDA hosts between 6 and 8 events per year, with the average rental cost of a tent being $200. So those hospitality tents that we rent that are next to the large stage are approximately $200 per event. So that's between $1,200 and $1,600 on small tent rentals annually, the hospitality tent rentals annually. So, you know, this particular tent would probably, even if it was a 10 by 15, would be recaptured within 1 year of usage. So it seems like it would probably be a good direction for us to go. We do have a special program supplies budget of $5,000, so this would probably come out of that line item. Staff recommends the 10 by 15 tent, allows for a little bit more flexibility, but just wanted to get your thoughts. We can also, of course, adjust the design. A first iteration that we kind of tossed around was, of course, keeping the main logo on the front peak, and then the valance, we had the live, work, eat, play icons, but it seemed like it was a lot. So we kind of filtered that down to just writing out Tyrone Downtown Development Authority on the front. So if we want anything different on the front, or if we want anything to be modified, you can just let me know.
What size tent are we currently renting?
We're renting one, I believe it's a little bit more like a 10 by 15. Yeah. It may even be just slightly larger than a 10 by 15 from the look of it. It's a different style of tent. It's not a self, put it up. They probably have to have a couple man crew to put it up.
It's like a circus tent where they actually tie it down and
Yes,
got the
yeah.
posts and everything of that nature. Thoughts, any questions?
I like the 10-15 with the 2 posts or peaks. It makes our graphics stand out more.
Yeah, our graphic is a little bit more of a landscape graphic, so the longer,
Yeah,
even though it's only 5 feet longer, it allows the logo to probably be triple the size.
yeah, I like it.
Does anybody have any thoughts about the graphics? Are they fine with that? Okay.
Defer to Jenny.
Is the lighter part?
So yeah, so it's the color scheme that we approve for the standard logo. So the Tyrone, so downtown and the little pinpoint are that lighter kind of green, that sage green, and then everything else is the town's dark green color, the official town color. Yeah.
That's so? Do we have a motion? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry?
Well done, Philip.
Okay, yes, as always. Do we have a motion?
I'll motion to approve the 10 by 15.
For the for the $1,212?
Yeah, we
Or
can
how
make
is that?
that.
Is that an exact price, or is that an estimated
I would
price?
probably, and I apologize, I didn't specify that. I would say not to exceed $1,500 would be my, because prices sometimes fluctuate. So when I got this quote, it was $1,200, but it might change by the time we order.
So your motion would be?
To approve not to exceed 1,500 on the 10 by 15 tent.
Do you have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so be it. Very good. Thank you for that, Philip. We come to our second public comments period. Anybody that has anything to discuss, no matter what it is? Being none, do we have any staff comments?
Only to just let you all know about the dynamic change. So you know, Philip and I worked together on getting the DDA activated. That was a couple-year process. The function of the DDA truly falls under his department, you know, community development, economic development, all of that. So when we first got started, just because of my role, I wanted to kind of, you know, get the experience and kind of get everything rolling. But, you know, your day-to-day liaison at this point is gonna, from here on, will be Philip, because this really falls into his wheelhouse. But both of us are gonna be, you know, continuing to work with you all on this. Of course, you know, overall, this all falls back on me, of course, as the town manager. But, you know, I think we got it teed up really well. And y'all know Philip is fully capable of day-to-day stuff, anything that you want added to an agenda, stuff like that, just like you would with me for a council meeting, Mr. Campbell. You know, pass it through Philip. If he's not available, give me a call, but we'll get it taken care of. Your day-to-day staff liaison will be Philip.
Well, on behalf of all of us, we thank you for everything that you've done. Philip and you have done a phenomenal job, and we thank Ally for her expertise in there. But without it, we wouldn't have gotten off the ground without the two of you guys doing what you did, and thank you both for that. So, any committee comments? Well, I will say that Friday night's event turned out to be what I considered, you know, pretty good. We had a nice crowd there. The weather turned out to be very nice. The entertainment was good. I heard, again, very positive responses from the people that were there. Food vendors all seemed to do very well. And I think it was, you know, for what we've got at this point in time, I think it was another successful. So we look forward to the September 2nd one with the, and I was corrected, I called them the Vixens, but they're the Vintage Vixens that will be performing that night. So we look forward to that. Is there a need for executive session? Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Make a motion.
Okay. Anybody, all in favor? Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you. And thank you for those that came today. That's good. We're getting a few more people each time. We got more people here now than we do for some of our council meetings.